Good morning, everybody. There will be people joining because it is the first meeting in the morning, so maybe some of you are still in some startup procedure. But we are here now in the session on data logistics for AI as part of the Data Week. And some housekeeping rules. You will be muted. That's also because this is a webinar and not a regular Zoom meeting. Everybody is requested to turn off the video, but the Whova platform, it enables Q&A and also chat. But if you want to ask a question to the speakers, please use the Q&A tab in the Whova platform. And the chat can be used for any other types of communication. I think that it is best to keep to the Q&A interaction because we have a quite full agenda. And we would like to have all speakers be able to present their views on this topic today. If there's technical issues, you can contact the Zoom host, the ones that you got the invitation from for this meeting. That is Jacob. You will have received emails from him. So the agenda for today, first there will be a very quick introduction from my side. It will be extremely quick, and that is what I've already started to do today. Then we will build up the idea of data logistics for AI from the bottom up. Ed Curry, many of you know him. He will give a very brief tutorial on what data spaces are and specifically what they mean for the further development of AI. Then there is, of course, Data Governance Act, which also has an impact on how data spaces and specifically actors in data spaces, what they can and what they cannot do. And Julie Baloup from the KU Leuven will explain that to you. And then we have two stories from two different countries where two speakers will introduce how they have worked on data sharing for AI, and both these stories are based on the IDS architecture and principles. First, the German experience. First, Julia from IDSA will briefly explain what IDS is, and then Ruslan of Fraunhofer will tell a little bit more about their experiences in working with these principles. And then Frans van Etten from TNO will explain how things work out in the Netherlands, where there is a national coalition on AI. And then we finish off with some ideas and thoughts towards the future, and that concerns the interoperability between AI data spaces, and that will be introduced by Harry Bastiaansen of TNO. And then hopefully we still have some time for Q&A at the end, and we need to end exactly at 11 o'clock because of other sessions coming up in this Data Week. So a few more words on the session design. The background idea for the session is that data sharing is already a complex issue. Data sharing for AI is even more complex. So we prefer to call it data logistics because you really have to carefully plan and manage how data is moved around. So we really think that for AI, we need to consider some special arrangements to make it work. So the session should identify what the challenges are with this and also give an indication of solutions for these challenges. And we think that we expect that we cannot give a comprehensive overview. It will be rather a chart of the territory. What do you encounter when you are addressing data logistics for AI? So there will be some presentations. Questions can be posed through the chat on the Whova platform. Maybe there is time for one or two quick explanatory questions right after the presentation, but we expect that real discussions or questions that require longer answers, that they will be answered at the end of the session. So that was my very quick introduction. Indeed, just 5 minutes, and then Ed will continue with a presentation in almost the same speed on the meaning of data spaces for AI. So Ed, you can share your screen.
Freak. There we go. So we are now sharing. You can see okay, Freak?
Yeah. Yeah.
So welcome everyone. My name is Ed Curry. I'm from the Insight Center for Data Analytics, and I'm also Vice President at the Big Data Value Association, and specifically working in BDVA on data spaces. And Freak asked me along today for this session just to kind of set the scene a little bit about the role of data spaces to solve, we'll say, the data logistics challenges for AI. So where are these challenges coming from? Well, if we take a look at where our world is going now, we're looking at an AI-driven digital transformation. And if we look at all of the different types of uses of ICT to be able to optimize systems around our world, whether it's optimizing buildings or water networks, energy networks, optimizing agriculture, optimizing whole cities, what we see here is that ICT data is being used to analyze the system, analyze the real world, and to be able to drive better decisions, drive optimizations. And the key to this, and what people are talking about a lot this week in particular, and in the last few weeks, sorry, the last few years as well, are these notions of digital twins. Can we have a digital twin of the world? Can we have a digital twin of our car, of our building? And what a digital twin does is it gathers all of the data that we're creating about a particular real world entity, whether it's sensors or through other data sources. It brings that information together, it observes it, it orients it together so that we have this digital replica that we can then study, that we can analyze using AI techniques to understand how can we optimize that. And once we get some insights about the optimizations, we can then make decisions, informed decisions on that, and then we can bring that back to the real world through actuation and actually make changes that improve our society. And the key thing that we have here that actually enables this OODA flow that we have is the need for data. We need this data to be able to drive our AI. And where does the data come from? Well, it doesn't come from any single source. It comes from lots of different systems, from lots of different organizations, about lots of different topics. So if we just look at a digital car, what we see is that you have, yes, you have information on the connected car itself and how the car is operating, but it needs, for it to be smart and to be efficient, it needs to connect to all of these other data sources and information systems that have relevant information that are needed to make holistic decisions. So connecting to the infrastructure, such as charging stations or traffic management or parking, connecting to information services specifically for the occupant, whether it's navigational aids, whether it's entertainment for the occupants in the car, whether it's delivering content to business people in the car as they prepare for a meeting, and also connecting to organizations that are trying to create value-added services on top of this. So supporting fleet management, things like usage-based insurance, all of these types of things. And what we see here is that all of these are different independent information systems. Currently, they're all silos. So when we look at these together, what we see is that the challenge that we have is that we need to bring together all of these independent information systems and build what people in the systems engineering community call systems of systems. How do we get all of these systems that have been designed independently to work together as a coherent system? And the key to this is the data flows. The data needs to flow between the different systems so that one system can utilize data that's been created in another system. And this gives us our value chains of data flows that move between our systems in a smart environment. This is the key to AI. This is the key to making good decisions. But this is very challenging and it doesn't exist today. The key challenge we have is the interoperability of these systems. Now, while we've made lots of progress on the protocols of how you maybe connect systems together, where we're really struggling is around the semantics. And the semantics is core to data. It gives us the meaning, it gives us the insight that's there. And that's a real challenge. This is also a different kind of challenge that we're used to dealing with. When we started to use the ecosystem metaphor, because we were within the data community, we hadn't seen this before. You can't top-down design a system like this. It doesn't exist like this. And the ecosystem metaphor came out almost 100 years ago within the natural world. When they looked at the world around us, people saw that the environment, the organisms that exist in that environment, they have a symbiotic relationship. They interact with each other. There's a community there, and they work together. There's a balance that exists. And Tansley started to study this, and he came up with this ecosystem metaphor, which we're all familiar with now, but is actually a recent enough kind of phenomenon. In the data world, we've taken this metaphor. We now talk about data ecosystems. And in a data ecosystem, it's a socio-technical system. It's got people, it's got technology. And what the people are trying to do The organizations are trying to do is to extract value from these data value chains from either other organizations or other individuals. There can be lots and lots of data ecosystems. They can be oriented to different types of purposes. They can have goals around business objectives, or they can have societal purposes, we'll say around Green Deal, carbon emissions, energy efficiency. They can have different types of dynamics in the ecosystem. They can be a marketplace where people come to trade and to buy data. There can be a competitive aspect in there. There can also be collaborative aspects where people are just coming to support a good cause or a societal challenge. So we have the vision. We know that we want to bring all of this data together. We understand that this is an ecosystem of organizations that need to work together. But we do have a significant problem. In technical terms, and this is my only technical slide, but in technical terms, we're missing a data sharing layer. We just don't have this infrastructure to make simple data logistics for us there. It's incredibly difficult to bring those information systems together. Most AI projects, data analytics projects can spend anything from 40 to 90% of their budget on just preparing the data. This is a significant barrier. We need to solve it. And the reason we have this problem is that we don't have this unified data sharing layer. We don't have agreed principles about sharing data. We don't have clear understanding about the legal regulation issues around sharing data. We have issues around trust. We don't necessarily always trust the data that comes to us from an external source. We don't often trust our own data. We lack shared infrastructure between organizations, between individuals. So we need to be able to solve this. And there's different ways of doing it that can come from top-down initiatives, but also from bottom-up initiatives are needed as well. It's a combination of both. Within BDVA, we've been talking about the notion of data sharing spaces and recognizing that in data ecosystems, we'll have things like these data sharing spaces for sharing data. We'll need data platforms. We'll also need to support data marketplaces as well. And specifically, the purpose of the data sharing spaces is to give us a way of being able to connect data from across these silos, across organizational, sectoral, geographical silos together, and to make it easier for data to flow between them. And there's lots of examples that we've talked about over the week, everything from Skywise, in aviation, waternomics around airports, and a lot of the work on what the European Commission is looking at from a common European data space point of view. What this gives us is that we can then build our AI systems. We can observe the world, we can orientate the world, we can decide on the actions we need to do, we can make the changes. But where we get the data from will be from these data spaces. We'll use these data spaces as the way to be able to simplify the logistics that we need to be able to implement our AI systems. And that's really the core of many of the talks that we've had this week, the core of what we're going to talk about now for the rest of today. And it's a core of what we've been doing in BDVA as well. We recognize that building these systems are challenging. It's something that hasn't been done at scale before. It fundamentally has a technological element to it. It has around technology and data, and that's really important. But actually, the real challenge, the real barrier goes beyond the technology. It's around how do we have appropriate governance? How do we have appropriately skilled people? How do we support organizations so that they can go through the changes that are needed to be able to participate fruitfully in the data space and to benefit from it and to evolve in our digital transformation that's happening? And most fundamentally, everyone needs to have trust in what we do collectively. And this is very much at the heart of what we talk about within BDVA. And this data sharing wheel comes from work within our BDVA task force on data sharing spaces. So Freek, I hope I've set the scene for you to kind of give us an idea of why this is such an important conversation and why data logistics, if it's not solved, will basically prevent us from having this fruitful AI future, this AI-driven transformation of our businesses and society. And I'll hand it back to you, Freek. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Thanks a lot. And that was an awful lot of ground to cover in such a short time. So it's always good to pick a native speaker for that, because you can speed up and still remain intelligible. So that's very good. You put forward a number of quite nice challenges, and I somehow have the feeling that the IDS people will have some answers to that, but I'm not sure, obviously. Let's see what they bring up. But I think this is a very good piece of groundwork. There's one player, because governance is on the top of the wheel here, and we've recently seen the Data Governance Act popping up. And I think it's a very good idea now to ask Julie of the KU Leuven to explain a little bit about the Data Governance Act and what it means for these data ecosystems. So Julie, the floor is yours, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
And can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, we're good then. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk in this session. So I am Julie Balou, and I work at K11 as a legal researcher. And so in this session, I will indeed address the issue of the impact of the Data Governance Act on actors in data spaces. So this will give me an opportunity to build on a little bit on what Ed mentioned in the previous topic. So about the issue of trust and governance. So for the purpose of this presentation, so I will start first by giving you an overview of the Data Governance Act, of the proposal for a Data Governance Act actually. And then I will do a focus point on data intermediaries to give you more specific information about how should and will data intermediaries have to behave. So let's start with an overview of the Data Governance Act. So to give a little bit of context, so in February 2020, the Commission published its European data strategy. As we all know, so the objective of this new strategy is to boost the EU digital economy. And how can we reach this objective? Well, the Commission identified that there is a need to foster data sharing, to make more data available for reuse. But there is also a need to create data spaces in strategic sectors. And of course, this is within these data spaces that cross-border data sharing can happen in the EU. So the question is, how do we increase data sharing and how can we support the creation of the data spaces? And well, the proposal for Data Governance Act is really a part of the answer. This proposal was adopted by the Commission so in November 2020. And so what's in this Data Governance Act? So this Data Governance Act introduces an harmonized data governance framework within the EU. So it's basically there to lay down the rules regarding how do we want to share data in the European Union. So obviously right now it's a very important step in our digital society to know how do we want to share our data. And it's important also because clear and harmonized rules, they are necessary to bring trust in data sharing mechanism, also to bring trust in data intermediaries, and finally, the objective being, of course, to foster data sharing. So now we'll see a little bit more in detail what's about this data governance framework. So here you can see on this slide that the Data Governance Act is based on 3 pillars. So the first pillar is the introduction of a regime for the reuse of data that are held by the public sector and that are covered by third-party rights. So here the idea is to unlock the reuse of data held by public sector bodies. Because as we all know, the public sector does collect a huge amount of data, and part of this data can be shared right now under the Open Data Directive. However, data that are protected by third-party rights, they are excluded from the scope of the Open Data Directive. For instance, if we think about personal data, but also non-personal data that are covered by IP rights. So for now, the reuse of data held by public sector body that are covered by third-party rights, this reuse is actually dealt with in national legislation only. So it's not harmonized at EU level, and there are many differences between member states. And as a result, right now, there is still very little of this valuable data that is shared by the public sector. So with this pillar, the objective of the Commission is not to create a right to reuse protected data held by the public sector, but rather it is to lay down harmonized rules in the EU under which the reuse of such data may be allowed by the public sector. And of course, this is done in a manner that ensures protection of the rights and interests of third parties, whether they are data subjects or, for instance, businesses holding data protected by IP rights. So that's for the first pillar of the Data Governance Act. Then the next one is a mandatory notification regime applying to data sharing services. So here the point is to increase trust in providers of data sharing services. So mostly it's to increase trust in data intermediaries that are considered as a category of providers of data sharing services. And so how do we do this? Well, we'll see in the focus points on data intermediaries, so in the next slide, that this legal regime includes very strict conditions to provide data sharing services. And here, this is a way to foster trust and to give incentives to data holders, for instance, to businesses to exchange their valuable data. So that's for the second pillar. And finally, the third pillar under the DGA. So with this pillar, the DGA introduces a voluntary registration regime applying to data altruism services. So here, the DGA introduces a new intermediary in the data value chain. So that's the data altruism organization. So this legal regime is a voluntary one. It means that the DGA gives the possibility for organizations engaging in data altruism to register, and they will register as a data altruism organization recognized in the EU. So here with this regime, the idea is to ensure that individuals, so for instance, data subjects and legal entities, they trust data altruism organizations in order to increase data sharing for the common good. So what's data sharing for the common good? Well, for instance, that would be data sharing for the purpose of scientific research, but also for the purpose of improving public services. So to sum up here, the DGA creates a data governance framework, and we should keep in mind that this data governance framework contains horizontal measures. It means that they are sector agnostic, so they are applicable to all the data spaces. The DGA also covers various types of data transactions for very different purposes. So it can be reuse of data for commercial purposes, but also, for instance, sharing of data for the common good under data altruism services. Finally, this data governance framework also covers different types of data, so whether it's personal data or non-personal data. Of course, when it comes to processing personal data, the GDPR will be the regulation that applies. So that's for the Data Governance Act really in a nutshell. So the three main pillars. Now I'll do a focus on data intermediaries. So first, the notion of data intermediaries. So data intermediaries under the DGA, they are a category of providers of data sharing services. And so they are providers of either intermediation services between data holders, so which are legal persons, and data users. They're also providing intermediation services between data subjects and data users. So here for personal data sharing. So what we can note in the DGA for now is that at this stage, there is not a clear definition of what are intermediation services, but rather the DGA provides for examples. And this you can see when it comes to intermediation services between data holders and data users, that the DGA gives examples. And they are listed here on this slide. You can see it's bilateral or multilateral exchanges of data. For instance, the creation of platform or databases enabling the exchange or joint exploitation of data. So those are only examples. In the recital, so it's so not in the as such normative part of the DGA, but in the recitals we can have some more guidance because the DGA there gives some indications as regards the role of the data intermediary in the data transaction, but also as regards the level of openness of the service. So, for instance, the role of the data intermediary under the DGA is to establish a business, legal, potentially also technical relation between data holders and data users, and to assist both parties in a data transaction. And also concerning the level of openness of the service, so only services aiming to intermediate between an indefinite number of data holders and data users shall be covered by the DGA. So in practice, from this, what we can see is that the objective of the DGA is really to cover as many actors of the data spaces as possible. But it's true that at this stage, the scope of intermediation services is still a bit unclear because there are no strict criteria that would allow all actors to identify whether or not they would fall under this regulation. and they will have then to comply with conditions. And that's important actually to have a very clear scope, because so as we're going to see in the next slide, being a data intermediary under the DGA does entail to comply with a number of strict conditions under the DGA. And those conditions are there. So what do data intermediaries will have to comply with when offering intermediation services? Well, first thing, before actually even being able to offer intermediation services, service provider will have to notify the competent national authority. So this authority will be at national level. It will be in charge of monitoring the compliance with this legal regime. So it means that it's only upon notification that data intermediaries may start their activities and offer their services in all member states. So that's for the notification duty, which is a prerequisite. Then, of course, in the course of business, data intermediaries will also have to comply with a number of conditions. Okay, the most important aspect there is the principle of neutrality. I guess you also all heard about it, and it translates into a number of conditions in order to foster trust in data intermediaries and data sharing mechanism. So what are those conditions that implement this principle of neutrality? They are listed here on this slide. You can see it's, for instance, the prohibition of cross-usage of data. This means that in the course of business, data intermediaries cannot use the data exchange for other purposes. But we also have, for instance, a limited intervention on the data exchange. And that means that data intermediaries have to facilitate the exchange of data in the format in which they receive it from the data holder. So, for instance, converting the data into specific format is still allowed, but should be limited. And for instance, it's of course allowed to ensure interoperability. There are other conditions there. For instance, one that is also of great importance is the obligation of structural separation. This means that intermediation services, they are to be placed in a separate legal entity, and that's also most likely to prevent data intermediaries to do cross-usage of data. So
could you try to to wrap up already a little bit, because we're running out of time actually.
I'm there. I'm done. Okay. More or less. So I just wanted to mention that there are, of course, more conditions under the DGA to be complied with, and that compliance is, of course, going to be monitored by national authorities that will be able to sanction data intermediaries that would not respect those conditions. And you can see. Here, the sanctions are listed: financial penalty, of course, but also cessation of or postponement of the provision of services. So my last slide now, I will be super quick. It's just in a nutshell. So what to keep in mind is that the DGA contains horizontal measures, that various types of data transactions are covered, personal but also non-personal data, and that the idea is really to cover as many actors as possible. And the overall aim, of course, is to bring trust by regulating data sharing activities. So I will stop there. And as a conclusion, I would just like to mention that with some colleagues, so we drafted a white paper on the Data Governance Act, and that it will be published soon. And in case some of you want to know more, you can contact me per email. And that's all on my side. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Julie. I must say I've heard already a couple of times about the Data Governance Act, but you have been able to summarize it extremely adequately, especially for people that want to be in the data exchange world. I think that was an excellent summary. Thanks a lot, Julie.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So, after these two introductions on the groundwork for data logistics for AI, it's time to dive into the actual nuts and bolts of data logistics. And of course, a very important initiative there is the international data spaces set of principles and architecture. And Giulia Giussani of the International Data Spaces Association will introduce us into well, the world of IDS. So Giulia, can you share your screen, or will it be Ruslan who shares his screen?
Yeah, exactly. But I think so. Now I can share.
Yes, we see it. Yeah.
Perfect. So good morning also from my side. As mentioned, my name is Giulia Giussani. I'm Digital Innovation Manager at International Data Spaces Association. I'm very happy to be here with you today to give you an insight of what the IDS approach is. So I will link from the topic of the European Union and the efforts toward the data exchange. So if we move to the next slide. Yeah, perfect. I will just add something to what Julie has just mentioned. The European strategy for data foresees data spaces in 9 key sectors. And IDSA has a lot of experience with regards to data spaces. We started working on this already 5 years ago. And what we can see from our perspective is that these 9 key sector data spaces will be more likely like a sum of several varying data spaces. And the key aspect is that they must be interoperable with each other. And this is done thanks to some shared design principles for data spaces and common frameworks. And this is exactly where IDS comes into place. But before we move into the details of what IDS plans to achieve, let me first go to the concept of data spaces. So how do you imagine a data space to be like? You can see a general and simple representation in this slide here. A data space can be seen as the sum of different endpoints that share data with each other in a federated approach. So some examples of endpoints are in the bottom and top part. You can see several companies and machines sharing data with each other and with, for example, cloud environments or data marketplaces. This is done thanks to the key element in data spaces, which is a secure gateway. And in the IDS vocabulary, this is called IDS connector. In addition to that, obviously, there must be some rules governing the whole ecosystem. But one key element that IDS brings to data spaces is the topic of data sovereignty. So IDS wants each data owner to maintain sovereignty over the data. And this means not simply the access over the data, so providing access to the data, but also governing the real usage of the data itself. And this can be seen in this picture by the light blue and white rectangular shapes. There are the so-called data usage constraints or data usage policies. Yeah, so this gives a little bit the insight on the concept of data spaces. If we go to the next slide, you can see that the simple data space can be scalable and interoperable with many others. And this brings us to the general domain-specific data spaces that are foreseen by the European strategy for data. If we go to the next slide. So as mentioned, the association has been working for some years on the topic of data spaces and data sovereignty. IDSA is a not-for-profit association for those that don't know it yet. And in the recent time, we've grown a lot. You can see we are now more than 130 members belonging from 22 countries. And through the working groups and task forces within the association, we are really working to achieve these challenging goal of data sovereignty, which can really enable the full power of the data economy, finding a trade-off between the data ownership, so really leveraging the data as an asset, but also providing free data flows and interoperability for the data exchange. How does IDS puts this into practice? So this can be done via three main principles. The first one is obviously unlimited interoperability, so the ability of connecting a variety of different endpoints with each other. And to this regard, there are some highly technical efforts. We've already created a German specification for the IDS connector. Then the second pillar is obviously trust. There cannot be data sharing if trust is not there. And on one hand side, we want to ensure trust via security, but also we want to certify not simply the components in an IDS data space, but also we want to certify the operational environment, so really the participants within the ecosystem. And to do that, we've also come up with some processes that manage the interactions, and linking to what Julie said before. In this context, we came up with some third parties, so neutral entities that really make sure that trust is there in the ecosystem. And last but not least, the governance for the data economy is the third pillar. So this goes back to the topic of data usage control. So we really want to be sure that we can enforce some data usage policies. And in general, on top of that, as mentioned, IDS not simply deals with the technical interoperability and technical side of data sharing, but we really want to make sure that we are also able to manage the legal side of data sharing, and in particular to enable that also all the operational relationship between all the actors that comes into play. To that regard, just a very quick mention to the IDSA rulebook. That's the document that contains all the technical, legal, and operational agreements to make data sovereignty in data spaces a reality. And we've published it this year. We're already working on the next version. So if you're interested, do not hesitate to contact me. This was a very quick introduction. If you want to know more, I warmly invite you to an informative session that I will have at the end of June. I can also post a link so that you can register to that. And before this informative session, we will also have our GRAPE summit for this year. That's the week before. So if you would really like to know more about IDS and the use cases and know what's the current state, do not hesitate to register to that one as well. Okay, sorry, Ruslan, I think it took me a little bit longer, but yeah, the floor is yours to explain how IDS comes into place in AI marketplace.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julia. So then I'll continue with the AI marketplace. I'll make the motivation a bit shorter and directly go into the the actual application of IDS technology and IDS concepts that we use in the scope of the AI marketplace. But just to give you an idea of what the AI marketplace is, the AI marketplace is a funded research project in which we develop a platform for AI and product creation. And actually, this platform is also called the AI marketplace. So the project itself follows the goal to build an ecosystem for AI and product creation. And basically, artificial intelligence is our the technology that we want to promote in the area of product creation, and we do this by means of a digital marketplace. And the reason why we think that this is important is because as of now we find the following situation in industry. So on the one side, we have industry companies who could actually benefit from utilizing AI in a variety of different processes, especially because product creation gets more and more digital. And on the other side, we have AI experts, startups, research institutes, and so on, who could actually provide suitable solutions. But the problem is this transfer of the solutions into industry. And the reason is that on the one side there is a lack of communication expertise, so no access to expertise on one side. On the other side, lack of domain knowledge, but also the lack of available data for example, for training applications or for just identifying whether which models could be applied to certain data. And the reason is that, especially in industry, you often deal with very sensitive data. So industry companies are often concerned about just handing over their data to a startup. And on the other hand, because the AI experts do not have access to this data, they also lack understanding for this data structures and also cannot assess how to apply AI on this. And what we want to build in order to support this is the platform AI marketplace. We want to do this in several development stages. As of now, we are somewhere in the middle. So we have a first setup of the secure data space. So in the first iteration, we developed an intelligent matching. So basically just bringing together companies from the AI field and from the product creation field. And right now we are dealing with the first prototype for data exchange, data sharing, and so on. Of course, this will continue throughout the whole project runtime. And towards the end of this year, we want also to start not only exchanging or thinking about how to exchange data, but also how to exchange software, models, and so on. And towards next year, also how to support the development of new applications. And so right now I would like to give you an example of how IDS comes into play here. But before I go into the IDS concepts, I want to start with the first development stage. So what we support in this first development stage is basically this matching. So we bring an industry company and an AI provider together. They find a common project and start collaborating. And what happens afterwards is that the industry company usually has to provide data to the provider who actually trains an application and provides the trained application to the company. And of course, this simplified version usually would have several data sources, or you might use data from several data sources. But nevertheless, this works to some extent, but this works only for a limited amount of use cases or only in specific situations, because there are some challenges involved here, which are especially related to trust between the entities. So usually you would need to set up contracts, to set up the whole infrastructure to exchange this data, and also to provide the final app. And as already mentioned, you might even have data from several data sources. And for this reason, we want to extend the platform throughout for development stage 2 and 3. And these extensions will mainly deal with data and app management. The general idea here is that now we have a central service which gets the data, which gets the app, and basically the app is trained on this data or adapted on this data. And finally, you get the final trained application without having, I would say, too much data exchange. Of course, you still have to provide this data to the or upload it to the AI marketplace. But in this scenario, the AI provider might not get the full data, maybe just a test set to validate it, but not the complete data management and data that is available. And the big advantage here is that the amount of technical resources and also contracts is reduced, because now you only have to set up a contract with the AI marketplace itself. But nevertheless, you still have some risks involved in this data upload. And also this data upload in this for stage 2 and 3 basically relies on proprietary technologies. And for this reason, we want to enable a data connection via the IDS ecosystem here. This basically means that the companies can use the IDS ecosystem to directly connect to the data and app management. And and utilize all the IDS technology that is available. And basically the IDS ecosystem assures that the advantages that Julia just mentioned and the rules that are provided, that are defined within the IDS ecosystems, are automatically, technically enforced when uploading this data. And so this is how the IDS technology, IDS concepts, and so on plays into the AI marketplace. And just to give you an idea of how this looks like in the end. So on the one hand, we will still have this proprietary connections via APIs, via just direct data upload, because at least as of now, a lot of customers still have this type of connections or just their data as a data package. But what we anticipate is that, especially in the future, as IDS technology evolves and also the requirements get stricter, we will need an additional connection via this IDS ecosystem. And basically this supports the same functionality, but with the ensured trust and rules that are defined by the IDS ecosystem. And of course, this also supports interoperability with other platforms that might rely on the same technologies. Yeah, so this was the short summary of the project and how we use IDS technology. And just to give you an idea of the project itself, it started last year, will run until end of next year. And we have a variety of sponsored partners involved, and also a lot of associated partners who basically are interested in this project. And as you can see here, there is also a high interest, especially from industry. And yeah, so I think this is a good final statement. And then I would hand over back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ruslan. Thank you. That was, and Julia as well, that was a very good introduction into IDS for those of you that are not yet familiar with it. And I also really like the example that you gave, which is specifically geared towards the application of AI there. And maybe during the Q&A, while we have some time at the end of the session, but we're already running late, I would be interested to discuss a little bit how this would relate to the AI for EU projects that the European Commission has started, because there are definitely some parallels and maybe some complementarity there as well. But yeah, that's an interesting topic probably, but this was, well, after the introduction of IDS and how this is approached in the context of AI in Germany, I would now like to give my colleague from TNO, Frans van Etten, the floor to explain to us how this is picked up in the Netherlands with the Dutch AI Coalition. So Frans, yeah, there you are. The floor is yours.
Yeah, hi. So let me try to do this right. And as usual, I have troubles to get it in the proper manner. Okay. So
we concluded that you're not the only one. I think 50% of all presenters have problems with this, so it means it's a design flaw and it is not a lack of intelligence from your side.
No, but my PowerPoint is having troubles here. So maybe we have to do it this way then. I don't get it on presentation mode. Can you still see the screen?
This works. This works as well. Yeah.
So then you see also the layout on the left-hand side. Apologies for that, but sometimes those things happen. So thanks a lot, Freek, for the introduction. So what I would like to do is to give you the perspective from the Netherlands. Yeah, my name is Frans van Etten, and I am the responsible for the program AI at TNO and very much involved in the Dutch AI Coalition, specifically on the topic of data sharing. So we have a working group on that, and that is really the focus for this 10 minutes, 15 minutes talk. So a quick introduction on the AI Coalition itself. So it started roughly 2 years ago. We saw from a lot of countries initiatives and national documents, strategies, indicating what they wanted to do with AI. And of course, there were already thoughts about it in the Netherlands, but it had to be brought together, basically. So what do we want to do as a country on AI, and where should we do more, where should we organize on a national level, that kind of thing. So we had roughly, in the beginning, 5 parties, but then it grew to 30 parties that were sort of articulating what the strategy should be going forward. And there were basically 5 topics that stood out. So very quickly, one was on startup scale-ups, one was on research and innovation, one was on the ethical, legal, and societal acceptance of AI. But the very important one that came up was data, so access to data, and Ed already alluded to that, and also in the other presentations that came across as an important topic. So also in the Netherlands, getting access to data, how do we organize that? How do we solve it for our organizations and our constituents? That was clearly top of mind. So then somewhere in 2019, the coalition started. And it was a huge success. There were 400 participating organizations in a matter of, I think, half a year or so. In the Dutch context, that is probably the biggest public-private partnership that we have, at least as far as I know. So AI, very dominant, and within AI, the concept of data, and then the access to data. Those are really things that a lot of people are very concerned of. How do we do this? How do we make it work? You see, very small in the picture, our Secretary of State, she opened it up and also made sure that we had the initial funding. So Kickstart financing was available to the coalition, 23 million to start with. But there's also a bigger thing in the Netherlands called the Growth Fund. And then in April, we learned that, say, the Dutch AI Coalition, which had submitted a proposal, was awarded 274 million in the first stage. So that gives us some room to maneuver and some good money to play with to really make it work, also on a national level. Now, what did we do as the data sharing working group in the AI Coalition? Of course, first we spoke to the members. And what stood out was that, I think here we probably talk with a lot of experts, but even big organizations in the Netherlands, be it both government and for profit, there was very little know-how on the concept of responsible data sharing. How do you do that? So the first task was really to build up the knowledge, and we created some documents and some links here in the presentation there to explain how responsible data sharing with context of data sovereignty and design principles the like are included, and so we made sure that was put on paper and available, and we presented that kind of thing. The other topic was people really wanted to make their hands dirty with then, okay, so on paper it looks like this, but then in practice, how does it work? So we did actually 3 proof of concepts working together with various sectors to show how responsible data sharing works. And then finally, we also made a plan to really scale it up. So in a proof of concept, it's always easy. You can play around a little bit with some stuff, but how do you really scale? How do you make it work in real life? So that is now the next step, and I want to share the plan also with you. On the horrible this. Yeah. So never had such issues with PowerPoint, but okay, never mind. So the concept, the proof of concepts, how did we do that? So we really took the notion of IDS, the reference architecture of IDS, which starts with the data owner who has to be in control of the whole thing. And so data sovereignty as the starting point. There might be a data service provider in between. There's several roles in there. And then ultimately the data needs to be used by the data service consumer. And there we built this 3 proof of concepts last year. So one in the medical sector, and there we explored the concept of the algorithm to the data. So not putting the data together, but really let the algorithm visit the various data sources. There it gets trained, it gets back, and then ultimately, centrally only you have a better algorithm. You don't have the data pooled. And we wanted to see how that functions in the IDS context. The second one was with the government sector. There we really tried, there's a use case there on poverty, and the the element there is that you want to pull data from various government sectors, from different sources. But how do you make sure that there's legal grounding and there's consent and there's the whole legal aspects of it? We really also want to explore that. And the third one had to do with migrations, and we took the energy sector as the example. And understanding that organizations and also data spaces will be in different sets of maturity, maybe different principles, different setups. How would it work in such a scenario? And every time we deployed IDS as the reference architecture, so the connectors and the way of working and the role model, etc., as the guiding light for us to get us through the whole thing. Okay, so that was last year. That was the knowledge. Now the plan going forward. Now we feel that of course AI very crucial, very important. Data in there important, and then this concept of silos. How do we solve that? And we feel with a little bit of arrogance that we have a good starting point in the Netherlands for a couple of reasons. One, we have some experience with data sharing. There are a number of working contexts already, the Smart Connect Supply Network and others. So there's some experience, there's a certain level of know-how. We've been involved from, not the start, but very soon on in the IDS world. So the know-how is there. Secondly, the size of the country also works. So we're not that big, we're somewhere in the middle, maybe small. So it's fairly easy to find each other, and that helps in the context of federated systems. And then finally, we have the concept of PPPs and working together is very, very natural to us. We always had to do that with finding the water. So that is something that we that comes natural to us, and therefore, but there are these elements that make data sharing basically something that has a fruitful ground, you could say, in the Netherlands. Now, to make this more practical, what do we want? So ultimately, we want a data sharing trust framework or system, whatever you want to call it, that is easy for everybody. So organizations should just be able to go to an ICT provider, a system integrator, what have you, to say, look, I want this in my environment. So service enabled. Secondly, it should be application execution, so not big from 0 to a million code lines building ICT. No, application execution in secure environments, simple. And then embedded advanced data sharing controls. So the concept of the IDS controller, that is something that is very, very important. So that is also it's embedded in the systems, if you will. And then ultimately you have this many data sharing solution, which will have these multiplier effects. And so the more organizations that start in this peer-to-peer way of working, we're absolutely certain that ultimately everybody will hook on. So then how does this all link together? We mentioned IDS, Gaia is there, European Data Spaces is there, Data Governance Act is there, so everybody's talking the same language basically. So this needs to link up on a European level, if not on a global level. And then it needs to be translated in a national situation, like what we do in the AI Coalition or in the Data Sharing Coalition. It's another one in the Netherlands. So it needs to be translated on the national level and then ultimately in sectors. And that all needs to come into play. What we really see is that one needs to link to the other to make everything work. So we made this plan, which leads to 2024. What we want to do is really flourishing AI ecosystems where you have this plug and play data sharing. And then, of course, there are steps going to this. So our plan has been to, in certain steps, have a framework, have the standards, then have these proof of concepts, make them work, make them interact, make sure that the governance is there and other aspects, work towards proof of concepts, pilots, alpha, beta, and then ultimately make it work in the real world. So again, this plan has 7 components. We have this end in mind with the design principles of data sovereignty, etc. We need quality of proof of concepts. I share 3 of them with you. We built on collective expertise. So this is done with other universities, other companies. IBM is involved, Microsoft is involved, KPN is involved. But point number 4, very important, knowledgeable and a neutral facilitation. We want one concept. We don't want to work from 5 different concepts. So we need to speak the same language and one reference architecture, which we've chosen IDS, which was confirmed in the study that it's a very good choice to work on right now. Integration with the sector is very important, but also horizontals, as we call them. So linking with legal, ethical, and societal aspects that needs to be part of the whole thing, of course. We want to work with the hubs, like Brainport, Brightlands. Those are important hubs in the Netherlands where there's a very strong constituency of companies, organizations that make it work ultimately. And then align with international standards. So 3 tracks, proof of concepts to make it work in sectors, and then ultimately that needs to lead to the operational situation in 2024 earlier if possible. Then a second track where we build the generic capabilities, because clearly we don't want to solve only point-to-point solutions or anything. We want to build a generic solution where interoperability across sectors, between sectors, internationally works. So it is about standards and it's all about interoperability. And then the third part, and this is important, this is a federated solution. So the community is crucial, getting the community to work, making sure that there's a really an effort to get everybody part of the story that needs to be done. My final slide. But it's not only about technical, it is a whole range of things that we need to do. So business, make sure that the interests of everybody, that needs to be there, otherwise it doesn't function. Legal, the contracts, operational, make sure that the system works. Functional, we need to be clear about, what does it do? And then ultimately also the technical, what happens on the route. And with that, Freek, back to you. With apologies for the bad sharing of my slide.
Well, the content came across, and thank you for this rather nice summary of what's being done in this national coalition. I've heard a lot about it, but now I've learned a lot more. So thank you for that, Frans. So the next in line is Harry Bastiaansen, also from TNO, on the topic of how would interoperability between these ecosystems take place. So that is also relating back to what Ed introduced to us at the start of the session. And also I noticed that at the start of the session, well, there were not that many people in the room, but now the audience has considerably grown. The downside is that Harry has a little bit less time, but okay, so that means that the total volume remains the same. Less time, but more people in the room, so still I think the total volume of content remains the same. Harry, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I hope so.
Yes, we can. We do see the edit view of PowerPoint, but maybe you prefer to leave it that way in order to avoid.
I will try to do it in a slideshow mode, but
yes, excellent. Yep.
Okay, let me first start to give you a warning. And this presentation is going to be more in a deep dive on the challenges that we face on the topic that has been mentioned by several speakers already. Interoperability as a key thing to make the European Common Data Space work, and especially also for AI. But I will talk you through it quite quickly, because I think the sheets will be shared afterwards, and there's a lot of reference and additional text to read afterwards. So what I will do in this few minutes is sketch the broader context, go into data sharing approaches that we currently see happening, agreements framework approach and the data space approach, which is the main interest of the topic today, and then go to things that we call intra-data space compatibility and inter-data space interoperability. What are the issues and how are we approaching it at this moment? And if I say we, then I think it's good to introduce myself. I should have done that. Harry Bastiaansen, working for TNO in several data sharing projects, also working for and together with the IDSA on developing the data space concepts, and also with the Dutch AI coalition. So with the previous speaker, with Frans, I work a lot together. We started a broader context. When we started to work on the data sharing part of the Dutch AI coalition, like Frans told about, we identified a set of architectural principles. Most of them will be familiar to you. Data sovereignty being key for data sharing, federated architecture. In red, I have indicated 3 things that will come back in this presentation. First of all, we identified that for AI, it is important that we do not only share the data with third parties, but that we enable the infrastructure for locally getting access to the data and locally processing the data so that the data doesn't have to be shared at all. So you bring the algorithm to the data instead of bringing the data to the algorithm, because the latter one you should share it. And then technologies like federated learning was mentioned, I think, already, but also secure multi-party computation are being enabled by this infrastructure. We decided that we wanted to have a data space approach, and we went for IDS as being the best of breed for the data space approach. And the last one, interoperability between the main data spaces, is high on the agenda of the things that we are doing, and that will be the topic of the remainder of my talk. Like Frans said, when we started to work on the data sharing part of the Dutch AI coalition, we did a market analysis, and there were some observations there. There is not one fully developed architecture yet that suits all the things we would like to have. Fireware and IDS were identified as logical starting points. And by betting on IDS, that was the highest chance of success. So that's why we said we are going for IDS. What did we do? As part of the development of the infrastructure, we took the basic IDS role model. This is the basic IDS. How are you going to do that? And we tweaked it, tailored it for the AI data sharing. So it looks like we are doing something completely different, because this is now the role ecosystem that we are going to develop for AI in the Netherlands, but still the domain control is all IDS. But a lot of functionalities have been added and more specifically made specific for AI. And you see, for instance, these roles of the AI orchestrator, AI operator, and the algorithm providers that is really tailored for AI data spaces. But the infrastructure remains IDS compliant as an IDS basis. Then we looked at what's happening at this moment in the data sharing area. And an analysis was made, a non-exhaustive one, of all data sharing initiatives that we already see happening. Of course, this comes mainly from the Netherlands, but also some international initiatives. And there were some observations. Many siloed initiatives are there. There's a large installed base already of data sharing initiatives. So it's not a greenfield situation where you start from. That would be nice if you could do a greenfield situation, but that's mostly not the case. And what we see in this elaboration of all data sharing initiatives, that many are what we call agreement framework approaches and not yet data spaces. And I will go into that because that means something that you have to do for interoperability. Because what we see, and I use here, and it's also further explained in one of the next sheets, the data sharing agreement framework with iShare as an example. Why iShare? iShare has been working together with IDS and collaborating on making the iShare agreement framework approach work together with the IDS. So we hope that they will really merge the coming period of time. But in general, data sharing agreement frameworks are used in various sectors. What is the basis of that? It's mainly a group of participants working together, making a joint legal agreement on how to share data, the conditions for sharing data, do an authorization registry for the data sovereignty part, and enable these very basic functions, or provide these very basic functions for as a basis for data provisioning. And it's a good initiative because it's addressing one of the essential things that you have to do if you're going to build a data space. In addition to that, if you look at the data space approach, for instance, provided by IDS, additional functionality is being provided. And these additional functionalities are for several parts, for instance, on supporting intermediary roles for finding data, like the broker service provider, things for logging and data transactions, clearinghouse. We have the app stores in which the data apps can be retrieved from. It adds functionality on these levels. It does more on policy enforcement with the IDS connector, the security gateway. And it also enables an infrastructure for the local processing of data. What we said, we do not always want to bring the data to the algorithm, but we also want to do the other way around, the algorithm to the data. So we see in the market at this moment, there are a lot of agreement framework approaches. The European data strategy and the approach that IDS is taking is that we want to go to more a data space approach. There's a good thing about it, is that they are complementary. They are not separate things that there are competition, but you need both of them, and you need to combine them to build a successful data space. And you could say, if you look at the data space structure like we are describing it now, in which we distinguish a data space authority that is leading the data space, doing the governance, doing the legal part, that kind of thing, that is mainly provided by the agreement framework approaches that are currently being done. And you see more the intermediary infrastructure, the hard infrastructure for these intermediary roles, but also for the policy enforcement, that kind of things is being done by the IDS, the data space approaches. So that's the good news. They are complementary to one another. I will skip this one. But you see two challenges emerging. First of all, because we have these the agreement framework approaches and the data space approaches, and you need both to build a single data space for AI, you have what we now refer to as an intra-data space compatibility, taking care that these agreement framework approaches work together with the technical infrastructure for making it for doing the intermediary roles and the policy enforcement. So making the agreement frameworks, for instance, iShare work together with the IDS for the lower technical layers to build it. That's one challenge, intra-data space compatibility. The other one is, what we also see is several sectors, several countries, multiple application areas all build their own infrastructure. And for AI, it's of course best if you can share data amongst these individual data spaces, and then you get the challenge of inter-data space interoperability. So that's between data spaces. And we are currently looking into it too, in both of these aspects, how to deal with it. For instance, what I said for the intra-data space, getting the agreement framework work together with the data, the international data spaces part. Taking the example of iShare and IDS, because we see both of them working together, but also seeing them having done quite good work in that area. They are complementary, but there are things that still need to be aligned, and that's about certificates alignment. Who are you going to identify? iShare identifies participants, IDS identifies components. Access and usage control for data sovereignty. They use different standards, and they use one use access control and the other also does usage control. They work together, they are quite complementary, but they are not fully aligned yet. And we think that this is between iShare and IDS, and that will probably be resolved in the cooperation between iShare and IDS, but it will also be exemplary for other data sharing agreement frameworks and data spaces. So these things are we looking into how to do it. For iShare and IDS, we already built a proof of concept on how you can. The other one is the interoperability between data spaces, if you have a data space for different sectors. And then that becomes quite complex. Because if you are going to look at interoperability, you have to do it what we call multi-level. It's not just technology, it's also about semantics, about organization, it's about legal concepts. Such a multi-level interoperability approach has been defined how to do it by the European Interoperability Framework, and that's also where this picture comes from. You have to look at all these levels to make it interoperable. The discussion that you then get is, how are you going to do that if you have separate data spaces and you really want to make them interoperable? You have more or less what we call two interaction topologies that you that you want to consider. First of all, you can say we are just going to connect them bilaterally. So we are doing intermediary to intermediary bilateral interaction topology to make them interoperable. Another approach is that you provide an overarching bridge between them, and an additional function to bridge the gaps between these data spaces. And it's not always unambiguous which one you are going to use. And in general, you would say we would like the first one, intermediary to intermediary, because that gives the least things with added things that you have to do and with governance that you have to put on it to make a bridging function between all these data spaces. So what we are currently considering is, how can you do that for these individual layers of the interoperability framework to address this interoperability? Are you going to build an intermediary bridge between them, or can you do it bilaterally? And what does it mean for the standards that are being developed? I won't go through it quite as extensively, but you can read it later on. We're also discussing this with IDSA because it means something on how are you going to develop your standards and your governance. Technical interoperability at the lowest level, it's about a handshake protocol, and for IDS you use the IDSCP, but there are maybe hybrid solutions. Identity and authentication. Also, the brokering, finding each other. The federated catalog is quite an important development. How are you finding your data sources across these data spaces? And the authorization registries, how are you going to do it? This technical interoperability, a lot of work still has to be done, but it's doable. It's just technology, and we are good in technology. Legal interoperability is quite a challenging one, because it's about legal agreements and what happens if you don't stick to your the agreements that we made, and we are not in the same data space, and we have different legal agreements or even different countries and jurisdictions. How are you going to deal with that? Currently, we are mainly looking at an overarching legal framework. It's also being done by, for instance, the Dutch Data Sharing Coalition as an approach to do so. But it's really a main challenge, legal interoperability. The semantic interoperability and organizational interoperability, they are less difficult because they are not so much on a direct interoperability, but more about providing value-adding services that you can retrieve from each other. So I also give them less attention in this presentation. So, observations, interoperability is really key for realizing common European data space. Within the data space, we see, the intra-data space compatibility, we see that the gradual migration strategy is feasible from such an agreement framework approach that is commonly adopted already to more a data space approach. That it's feasible, but you have to, develop a roadmap for that. And the really data space interoperability is in an early stage of development. On these aspects that I showed on previous sheets, we are already doing some initial experimentation and building blocks on how it can be done for these levels of interoperability. But to make it really work on a European scale, standards have to be defined, APIs have to be defined, and that's all still in an initial phase. And there are open issues. How are you going to govern this interoperability for development and deployment? And what's the role of the IDSA in that versus the individual data space instances? Who is going to do what, and how are you going to get grips of that on that? So that were my sheets. Probably I took too much time. Sorry.
I saw it coming. Thank you, Harry. Initially, you said, oh, yeah, interoperability between data spaces. I just have some initial thoughts, some preliminary ideas. If these are your preliminary ideas, I am very curious. I'm even afraid of how a fully developed set of ideas from your side would look like. This is really impressive, and I like how you were able to curb back the introduction by Ed on the semantic interoperability, for instance, but also the legal interoperability that was introduced by Julie. You were able to pull things together very nicely. So that's, yeah, I think we really had a full overview of the types of things that that come up when you talk about data logistics for AI. I already put it in the chat that we have covered quite a lot of ground and many topics. And I can imagine that you may have some more detailed questions, maybe directed to one or two of the speakers. You may have noted their email addresses, but in case you were not able to note down the contact details, you can always send me an email and I will forward your request to the speakers. So you can see my email address right now. There were no questions asked in the Q&A of the WUWA platform besides the one that was specifically for the business to government data sharing that Julie has answered. Yeah, there was one thing coming up when I was listening to all of your presentations, and I'm curious, what are your ideas towards a national approach or an international approach? Because we've seen some very nice examples of France and of Ruslan on the German and the Dutch experiences that are quite nationally oriented. Harry informed us of, okay, what do you need to arrange if you want to have some interoperability between data spaces? So that's the international approach. So I'm curious, how do you think? Is it better to really start working in a national way, or do you need to start collaborating internationally from the first moment on? So I'm curious, what do you think of that?
Yeah, Freek, maybe I have some thoughts from my side. It has to be both. It has to be hand in hand, because without international standards, it always be local initiatives, and we can't fulfill the promise of interoperability. But without having it implemented on a national level, and it has to start in many cases small, it doesn't work either. So it has to go hand in hand. You have to have your local initiatives, sectoral, on the national level, and international.
Okay.
Maybe just to add on this, I would completely agree. So I think from this development perspective, how to develop, it's often easier to start locally and then to grow and continue this way. Mm-hmm. But I think what you definitely cannot do is just to say we limit us to for example, Germany, because this will just not work out, especially since often data is located in other locations and so on. And I think there are a lot of challenges that will occur, especially when it comes to legal aspects and so on. But actually for us, for example, the plan is also to expand, not to limit it to Germany, but the definitive goal is also to go beyond.
Okay.
From my perspective, we see these kind of developments that you're talking about in a lot of different sectors. And for some of these sectors, it might be logical to do it more per country. But for instance, myself, I'm quite active in the logistics and mobility. And we in the Netherlands are doing building data sharing infrastructures for both of them. But the Netherlands is a big transport country, traffic going from Rotterdam to Germany. So it would be quite strange that everything stops if we the border from the Netherlands to Germany. So also from the application area, logistics, mobility, but there will be more of them. There's quite a big urge to do it international and make it internationally work together. It's not building one one data space over these countries. No, there's one in the Netherlands. There will be one. There are also ones in Germany. And the only way to fix it is to make it interoperable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not going to be one big one. It's an illusion. I see.
There's also a governance aspect to this, and maybe that's also something for Julie to comment on, because you have the Data Innovation Board. That was one question that was asked in the WUVA platform, but that strangely also relates to this issue that we just brought here. What do you think is the role of the Data Innovation Board here? You're muted, Julie. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I have technical issues as well. So the Data Innovation Board is foreseen to be created under the DGA, under the Data Governance Act. And well, I think the role of this board will be to monitor how data sharing is happening in the EU. Yeah, I think that's most likely the role of this board. But so far, there have been questions raised on whether this Data Innovation Board would be sufficient, or whether there should be another board that should be created more specifically about release sharing of data. So we'll see what will happen, because for now, the DGA is at the stage of, it's a proposal, it's been only adopted by the Commission, so there will be more legislative developments, and we'll see what will happen. Maybe the task will be a bit clarified, and maybe even another body may be created. So I think it's probably worth waiting and see what is going to happen during the legislative process.
Yeah. Okay, so we need to look at what happens there. And also to finalize the perspectives of Ed and Julia. How do you think about this question of national versus international, and the role of potentially the Data Innovation Board in that?
Maybe I'll go first. Sure. So I agree with the previous speaker's comments. To add to that, what I'd say is that, so I'm a research scientist, I'm a computer scientist, and what's actually really interesting here is that there's a number of significant challenges as well from a research point of view. So we're now talking about data for AI, but I think what we need to start thinking more about now is AI for data. How can we start using more computational techniques to help us to understand data? So yes, I believe standards, if they're successful, can propel us forward. But there's always a scenario where there's edge cases where new fields are coming up and the standards haven't been established yet, and it could take us some time to do that. So are there computational methods, computational linguistics, semantics that we can use to help us understand data more, to help us get, we'll say, good enough interoperability before we need full exact interoperability. So I think there's a lot of research challenges for us there, in addition to these standardization efforts that are there as well. So I think it's an exciting time.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. I'm also in a research organization, so I really endorse your view, and indeed I recognize these topics. And then maybe finalizing with Julia's comments on this, and also from the IDSA perspective, what do you think are now the major steps forward for IDSA to really make things work like this in Europe?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously, I agree totally. If there's a chance to leverage the national hubs and environments, that's good, but we cannot limit ourselves to that. In the name itself of IDSA, so International Data Spaces, I think this opens up to multiple opportunities. And of course, we need to find a way to bridge all different initiatives. I think Harry really explained it very well, how we can work towards this interoperability with the one-on-one approach, but also with bridging the different initiatives. So for sure, there will be work to that regard also within the BDVA and the other initiatives working together. So from my perspective, I think it's really important that all these initiatives work simultaneously to find synergies and really speak with each other to build on that. I think a single initiative or company or ecosystem cannot achieve this big goal that we are all working together to achieve.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's a very nice conclusion. And I must say that I'm also optimistic about this, because I really liked how your presentations referred to each other. So that's kind of linked data already. And I also have the impression that at least the speakers that were on the stage today, they have some semantic interoperability. I really found that our views fitted together quite nicely. And together what Julia just commented on, that we must continue to create these connections, that is really something that will also help us to create the connections in the technical world of between the data spaces. So yeah, with that being said, it is exactly 11 o'clock. At some time I was fearing that we might not reach 11 o'clock in time, but I think we've been able to cover an awful lot of ground in this session. And I'm really looking forward to how all of these topics are developing. For now, I would like to thank the speakers. I would also like to thank the audience, which unfortunately have had to be a little bit silent, and that's because of the setting, but really looking forward to meeting you physically somewhere next year, probably. But for now, thanks for a wonderful session, and see you maybe somewhere later on.